It's the KC Arts Beat Report. I'm Patrick Neas. My good friend Vern Barnet is my guest today. I'm sure many of you know Vern. He is the founder and minister emeritus with the Center for Religious Experience and Study, known around Kansas City by CRESS. It's an amazing organization. It has done so much to promote interfaith understanding and cooperation and an exploration of how different faith communities have contributed to the community as a whole. And today, Vern and I are going to be talking about Beethoven, a timely subject, given that it's Beethoven's birthday on December 16th. And Beethoven is a very dear composer to Vern, and we're going to get into that. Vern, thank you so much for joining me today.
A pleasure.
Yes,
Happy
and
birthday, Beethoven.
for sure, absolutely. And we have talked about Beethoven for years, Vern. As a matter of fact, one of my earliest memories of you is you asking me what my favorite recording of the Hammerklavier Sonata is. And at the time, I had not listened to that piece that much, but you obviously had because you had a very favorite recording by Leonard Rosen. So I know you have had a long time interest in Beethoven. But before we start talking about Beethoven, can you tell us, sort of in general, just how music and your various religious interests came to be intertwined?
Sure. I'll try to not take the whole time answering that question. Uh, it might be interesting to your guests, and some may remember the 18 years that I wrote for the Kansas City Star,
Yes.
a column on interfaith work, and often I would write about music too, because I do feel, as you suggested with your first question, that music and spirituality are intimately connected. So maybe we'll have a chance to tease that out. But I do want your guests to know that I do not claim to be musical enough even to be a dilettante, though I have done some reviewing. I was very happy to do a review for the San Francisco Symphony when they performed last here under Michael Tilson Thomas in his farewell tour. Uh, I think the first review I ever did was for Country Joe and the Fish. So way back in the 60s. I also did the two, um, both claiming to be the original uh, cast recordings of Hair. One was the original, which I happened to actually see off Broadway in New York, and then a later version, which I didn't care for so much. Anyhow, so I do listen critically to music. I also had a chance to write a review for the Shostakovich Circle of Fifths when that was performed here. Very unusual piece by Dmitri Shostakovich. And I've reviewed some other stuff. I wrote in my doctoral dissertation, Patrick, I wrote comparing Handel's Messiah, which is appropriate for this season of the year, well, anytime throughout the year, but particularly during Christmas and Easter. I compared that with the rock opera by The Who, Tommy. So, although I really am not trained in music, somehow I have found myself, because of my religious interests, drawn into music. And I think partly that may be that from an early age, I sensed that um, there's something significant about what we might call tacit knowledge rather than explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge might be explained as um, how you ride a bicycle, whereas explicit knowledge is a bicycle has two wheels and a handlebar and a gear chain and so forth. That doesn't help you ride the bike. That's implicit. You learn to ride the bike by riding the bike. And I think music uh, is more like how you live your life. And it's very, yeah, sure, religions have tried to give you 10 commandments and so forth on how to live your life, but it's really not that explicit knowledge that is how you live your life. It's implicit. Michael Polanyi said, we know more than we can say. The exception to that, I think, comes from art, where art says something that we cannot really fully express in propositional language. And so that's the beginning of an answer to the spiritual interest that I have in the arts. But let me say a little bit more about my own background. When I was a kid, um, I grew up very poor, but we did have a radio. And I listened somehow. Nobody in my family was interested, but I listened to the New York Philharmonic and I listened to opera
Mm.
from the Met. And I was so naive about music. All I knew was that this was important, maybe because I heard people applauding after a performance.
Mhm.
But I remember when I was in third grade, there was an incident um, where I had not been singing the national anthem because, in my thinking, that was militaristic. But I was forced. I was um, told I would be expelled from school if I did not say the Pledge of Allegiance and sing the national anthem. So I succumbed to that authoritarian rule. I still kind of shake thinking about how unnecessary that was. But my point here, Patrick, is that when I began to sing the national anthem, I used vibrato. And I told my schoolmates that was opera because I thought opera meant vibrato. So that was the level of my education, or shall we say, stupidity about music. What
You've
else might
certainly
I?
come a long way since then, Vern.
Uh,
And you're also a composer too. Let's not forget that.
well, I actually, um, when I was in theological school, I was asked, I was sitting in on a course at the University of Chicago on electronic music. This was before the Moog was invented. Uh, and I got really interested in it. And a friend of mine who was a dancer asked me to compose a couple pieces for dance performances that she had agreed to perform at the Lutheran School of Theology. So I did two pieces, and then I wrote my, you'll smile, Patrick, when I say masterpiece, because I know you hate it. You've actually listened to it. I composed the Lament of Ahania, but it was accepted for a performance, an electronic piece on tape. It was accepted and performed by the Chicago Musical Society. One of the thrills in my life. Nobody applauds after a sermon, but I got applauded after this was performed. So I
Done.
remain very pleased with the piece, and someday you will develop the musical acuity to be able to appreciate it.
All I know is it killed the paint off of my walls.
Well, it takes a special listener to appreciate it, but I
So,
think it's worth a third or fourth listening.
well, maybe I'll figure out a way to post it online so that we can have a poll. But anyway, this all leads up to Beethoven, and Beethoven seems to have a special pull for you.
Well, uh, yes, but I don't want people to think that I listen only to Beethoven.
No, of
When I
course not.
when I was teaching a class on religion and the arts, I we dealt with from Palestrina to well past Shostakovich. So sure, Beethoven happens to be a life-saving for me. In fact, um, there's a real sense in which I would say that Beethoven was my savior. Now,
Wow.
as a Christian, I want to say Jesus is my savior, but biographically, I'd have to say it was Beethoven. And actually, I found something that I wrote to a friend some time ago that might explain why I would say Beethoven is my savior. Um, Let me see if I can find that here. Here's what I wrote some time ago to a friend. I doubt that I would be alive today except for these quartets, the Beethoven quartets. In my poverty as a college freshman, I bought a secondhand turntable without a needle, found a short piece of copper tubing, and attached a cartridge with a needle. I played those quartets in my despondency, and they gave me the strength to move ahead because I knew there was a way to transmute suffering into bliss. Compared to this, the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven is a supreme, joyous human affirmation, but the late quartets and sonatas are divine interventions of a wholly other order.
Wow.
Later, actually, uh, after that freshman year, I was able to hear the Budapest String Quartet uh, play one of the last quartets. And I didn't understand them, Patrick, but I knew there was something there. And, uh, later after I became acquainted with the Heiligenstadt Testament, I understood a little bit of the personal background. Of course, Beethoven had a disastrous childhood, but uh, the maybe your
Can you tell us
leaders.
what that Heiligenstadt Testament is?
It was written, I think, just before the Eroica Symphony was performed. I think I'm right on the date. You might want to check me on that. But let me read just a couple short passages from the Heiligenstadt Testament. It was his suicide note. Uh, O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, know how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret causes. It was impossible for me to say, speak louder, shout, for I am deaf. How could I possibly admit such an infirmity in the one sense which should have been more perfect in me than in others? a sense which I once possessed in highest perfection, a perfection such as few surely in my profession enjoy or have enjoyed. Farewell, and do not wholly forget me when I am dead. I deserve this of you in having often in life thought of you and how to make you happy. Be so. So, of course, as everybody knows, and the first thing I think I learned about Beethoven was that he was deaf. And, it is amazing. He was able to go on and compose um, in utter, complete deafness. And the works, the last sonatas and last string quartets were written in that awful silence that out of which he approached surely what Dante saw in the conclusion of the Paradiso.
Uh-huh. Vern, when we were talking about doing this podcast, you sent me a Peanuts comic strip. And of course, the only other person who might like Beethoven more than you is Schroeder. Can you kind of describe that cartoon? I don't have it in front of me. Could you describe it?
Well, Lucy sits at the piano with Schroeder playing Beethoven, and I don't have it in front of me either right now, but she says something like, uh, Schroeder, what does Beethoven say the meaning of, no, what is the meaning of life? And he simply shouts to her, Beethoven! And uh, so she says something funny in response, and uh, the cartoon concludes with uh, her or somebody wishing her happy birthday. I'm sorry, I don't have that cartoon in front of me right now, but it certainly shows, and I'm glad that the cartoonist repeatedly brought Beethoven to the readers of his comic strip
And
through Schroeder.
and in
Yeah,
the
Beethoven gives the meaning of life. And I will say that before I knew hardly anything about the biography of Beethoven, it was his symphonies that drew me uh, to be curious about Beethoven. And only later, as I learned about his biography, did I understand how great art can grow out of the struggles that people have. Beethoven, with his terrible childhood and then being deprived of the very sense of hearing, which was his livelihood.
Yeah, it reminds me of Monet too, who lost his sight and but still continued to paint incredible masterpieces, even though he was losing his sight. Now, it's interesting how cruel the universe can be. And I guess Beethoven is sort of his message is to he tries to help us overcome the cruel nature that the universe seems to have sometimes.
Uh, I can't think of any composer who does that better. And uh, the last quartets and um, you know the Hammerklavier. In fact, I got out the score for the Hammerklavier, and
Oh wow. Uh-huh.
here it is in front of you. Um, and the third movement is absolutely amazing. I have more recordings of this than anybody else on my block, I'm sure. And um, the third movement is really to me, the most spiritual. And um, the recording I have by John O'Connor spends 14 minutes and 44 seconds in playing that third movement. But Edith Vogel plays it in 23 minutes and 53 seconds. I cannot think of another piece in all of musical literature where the pacing can be so extreme, fast or slow, and yet the meaning is so potent. Can you think of another piece of music that has such flexibility to it and has such integrity that it can be interpreted in such drastically different speeds?
Vern, I think you're whetting a lot of people's appetites to listen to the Hammerklavier. Why is it called that?
Well, because Beethoven was going through a German nationalistic phase, and so the last 29th, 30th, 31st, and maybe the last one, the 32nd, he called them Hammerklavier, but the nickname has traditionally been applied only to the 29th.
I see. So, what is it about this particular piece, which is one of his later piano sonatas, right?
Yes,
What about it that appeals to you so much?
well, uh, I guess from, I don't know this firsthand because I don't really understand music technically, although, I've got marked right here where I think the movement pivots. And for any listener, that would be beginning at about measure 87 and then going through, mm, let's see, about 111. It's just ecstatic. It's variations. It's That's one of the amazing things about Beethoven. Nobody can do variations like Beethoven. Beethoven can't do a lot of good stuff. I mean, I was listening to the Misa um, a while ago and realized what a contrast with Handel, because Handel understood the human voice. Beethoven did not, but he certainly understood the piano and the stringed instruments. You asked me about about the Hammerklavier. Well, the first movement is with the whole sonata is based on thirds, which is an example of how Beethoven was always experimenting. Freedom is not the neglect of form, but the mastery of form. And Beethoven tried uh, uh, to develop new forms and to master forms, old forms, in new ways. The second movement is hilarious. It's just a kind of a commentary on this very vigorous first movement that has what I call Jesus rays, the sunshine breaking through the clouds within it. But as I say, the pivot is the third movement where you have these transcendent variations. And then the fourth movement is a tour de force of a fugue. Every conceivable form of fugue, um, upside down, backwards, forward, twice the speed, retrograde. I mean, it is an amazing, not easy to listen to, but very rewarding. It's not the sonata itself is I mean I'm becoming speechless trying to talk about it. But all of the last quartets are amazing in their way. But not just the last quartets. I mean, as I think about my own memorial service, I'm getting to that age where, you need to think about these things. As much as I love 29, 30, 31, 32, I think I will choose 28 um, to be the prelude for the memorial service because, again, Beethoven does this amazing thing where he has um, a melody that never ends. It never gets resolved until, many, many minutes after the first movement begins. So I would encourage any listener to go from Sonata 1, which is rollicking good fun, full of humor, to Sonata 32. The piano sonatas are just fantastic. And don't forget the Diabelli variations, another example of variations, which is, kind of a joke. Speaking of humor, which is one of the things, um, people think of Beethoven as terribly serious, but he's just belly laughter as well. I mean, he didn't invent the scherzo. The word scherzo means joke, but he really developed the scherzo, and they're just loads of fun. So there's so much to find in Beethoven. Sorry, I
No,
start
that's all right.
running on and on.
I wanted to ask you something else about the Hammerklavier. You've listened to so many different performances of it. What, in your estimation, makes a good performance of that work, and what don't you like about certain performances?
That's I um the first time I heard Charles Rosen, I thought there was something a little off, which, he wrote the book um, on the classical style, and he has a whole chapter on the Hammerklavier in that book. So I listened to it again and again, and I finally give it to him. As I say, I've got over a dozen recordings, and I have heard it live. One of the most interesting live performances by Pizarro in Lawrence.
Oh,
And I went to especially to hear it. And then he announced that he wasn't going to be performing it because he didn't feel he had mastered it sufficiently to perform it, but he would reschedule it in a couple days. So I went back to hear it again. But I've not heard what I would consider a bad performance. They're all different. And so the piece has it's so rich. I can't complain about any of the performances that I've heard. You want to get the music right, but each person that I've heard and that I've heard recorded, famous and less famous pianists, bring a seriousness to it. It demands that. Uh, so I'm not going to be ready to critique any that I've heard.
well, Vern, I'm sure Beethoven's up in his heaven looking down and finally smiling over your wonderful tribute to his genius. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but you've probably heard that his dying words were, "In heaven I shall hear." Have you heard this?
I have not heard that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I hope he's hearing your wonderful golden words about his music and his character. A true inspiration. I mean, really, anybody who thinks classical music is, hidebound and rigid and all of that stuff, they need to consider Beethoven a real rebel in his own day, a real punk rocker of his.
Well, he was. And Leonard Bernstein, in the beginning of his book, one of his books, uh, identifies uh, skills of a composer, and he shows how Beethoven comes up short in all of the ones that he lists. Um, but he has one gift that surpasses them all, in Bernstein's opinion, and that is what he calls the gift of inevitability. And he concludes the conversation that he's having with himself. He invents a character, LP, to go with LB, Leonard Bernstein. Uh, and after Leonard Bernstein says that this is the gift that leaves all other composers in the dust, the sense that every note that follows was the right one to follow the one that just preceded it, that gift of inevitability. And LP responds, well, that sounds almost like a definition of God.
I
And
will,
Bernstein replies, I meant it to be. So
I,
that sense of inevitability, which is why I, as a writer myself, uh, who struggles to get one word right after the next word in the right order. Beethoven was not a fluid composer like Mozart. He worked on things for years before he finally had them performed or published. And I'm that way. I struggle. So that gift of inevitability, that sense of inevitability, is the gift of God.
well, Vern, I think it's impossible to have a conversation with you that's not inspiring. So thank you for spending time with us. It's the day before Beethoven's birthday when we're talking about Beethoven, and he's a wonderful composer, beloved by many. And thank for sharing your personal insights into why he's special to you. It meant a lot to me for you to share that with us today. Thank
A
you, Vern.
great
And by the way,
pleasure.
give us the web address for Cress.
It's CRES. That's
Universal
Center,
experiences.
Roger, Echo, uh, Semaphore dot org, CRES.org.
CRES. Check it out. It's a treasure trove of spirituality. Vern, thanks so much.
Our pleasure.